This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at reactroundup.com/KendoUI.
Hello and welcome to React Roundup. I'm your host, Nader Dabbit. Today on our panel, we have Sia Karamalagos.
Hello.
And our special guests today are the RxJS ThisDot Media group of people. If you don't already know them, I'll go ahead and introduce them one by one. It's Ben Lesh, Jay Phelps, and Tracy Lee, otherwise known as Lady Leet on Twitter. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
Hey, everyone.
Well, thanks for coming on. This is pretty cool. Like, three of the people that I've followed on social media and, always wanted to meet. I met Tracy a few weeks ago, actually. So now I'm meeting the other two. So this is really cool to kind of have you all on.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, totally. It's a pleasure. I guess to kind of get started, for people that, don't already know you all, I know it's kind of hard to go into depth with three different people, but maybe kind of give a quick overview of why you all kind of are working together and what you're working on, and then maybe an introduction into the subject, which is reactive programming or RxJS.
Sure. I can start. This is Jay Phelps. I currently actually doing a startup with Tracy, and we're called ThisDot, and we do things like support contracts for RxJS. We do staff augmentation. We do developer relations, basically anything in the developer community. We also put on events. We do podcasts similar to this as well, and conferences and stuff like that. Previously, before that, though, just a couple months ago, I worked at Netflix, which is actually where I met Ben, who's on this podcast as well. We're coworkers together. And at Netflix is where I got introduced to RxJS, and where Ben and I came up with redux-observable in one of the apps that we were both maintaining and working on. So that's the quick gist. Before Netflix, I was a CTO of a company called PivotShare, and then before that, I worked at another company called Sign Now.
I'll go
Cool.
next.
So, yeah, go ahead.
So my name is Tracy, also known as Lady Leet. Thanks for the introduction. I co-founder of ThisDot with Jay, and Ben's also co-founder. Even though he doesn't get to play with us as much because he works at Google developer expert for Angular and the web. And then I'm on the RxJS core team, and I help lead the learning team as well. And I love JavaScript. So I guess that's it. Oh, how did we meet? So my story of how we met was there was this random dude, Jay, which was fine. And then there's this guy, Ben, who came to heckle at the first modern web meetup that Jay spoke at. And he sat in the back, and he had a lot to say. And then my co-organizer at that time was like, "Whoa, Ben Lesh, so cool." I was like, why does this guy matter? What is this RxJS thing? Who cares? But anyways, apparently I was supposed to care. So then we started all hanging out. Jay and Ben used to stand in my kitchen during potlucks and eat.
That's what we're known for.
That's what you guys used to do. Both of you guys would just stand in the kitchen for some reason.
We like
we eat the ice cream that tasted like pool toys. That was really good.
What was that ice cream? It was
saffron.
Yeah.
Saffron ice cream tastes like blow up pool toys for all of you guys who didn't know.
Yes, it does.
Weird, right? But
Tracy and I actually met at EmberConf.
Oh, that's right.
If you remember that, Tracy. Yeah,
that's true. Ben, what about you?
Let's see. Well, I'm most known for being the project lead on RxJS currently. I work on the Angular team at Google. So that's relatively new. I've been on the Angular team now for a couple months. But I've known those folks for a while and been working with them for a while because RxJS is their only dependency. So there's that. I was previously at Netflix for about 3 years, and I've been at Google for a little over a year now. That's pretty much it. I can't think of anything else. Worked with, obviously, Jay went over our history together. We work together. We hang out together. He comes over and has waffles at my house sometimes. And then, of course, Tracy and I are glued at the hip at various conferences. So there's that.
Yeah, I see you two kind of hanging out quite a bit on social media for sure. Are you all kind of like located near each other, or?
It used to be.
Yeah, we used to be.
Yeah.
We used to all live in the Bay Area, but unfortunately,
I'm the last Mohican.
yeah.
The only person left.
Yeah, I moved to Tennessee just a couple months back. Actually, when I left Netflix, I moved to Tennessee to save money and have a change of pace. I was in California for 10 years, but I was born and raised in Nebraska. So just looking for a different scenery while I did the startup thing with Tracy.
Well, that's cool. Me and Sia are also in the Southeast. I'm in Mississippi. Sia's in Louisiana.
Yeah.
And I'm in North Carolina.
Hi, neighbors.
Oh, there we go.
Hi.
Another one.
Way to go south. All right.
So how are you liking Tennessee, just out of curiosity?
Since I've only been here a couple months, and of that, I've actually been out of town a lot of it. I don't actually totally know, but so far I like it. It's definitely more similar to Nebraska than California, just in general. And it's a nice change of pace. Things are a lot slower. People are more friendly. Traffic is not nearly as bad, and things are cheaper. So far it's living up to the expectations I was hoping for it, and we'll see.
Awesome. So I'm wondering, like, for those of our listeners that maybe don't know what an observable is yet, do you want to give like a brief intro of like what is an observable and like what problems are observables trying to solve?
Can I give the pitchy?
Yeah.
I was
Okay,
just
go for
going to
it.
say that.
Yeah, so the pitch is that if you're just learning JavaScript or you're having trouble with promises, you shouldn't learn promises. You should just learn observables. Did you like that?
Wow, that's a hard sell. That's a good one.
That's a hard thing.
But they're just, observables are just functions in JavaScript, right? They don't do anything unless you subscribe to them, or just like functions in JavaScript. They don't do anything unless you call them. And Ben has been actually working really hard, and I'll let Ben and Jake give like a more deep technical, explanation. But Ben's been working really hard on like making everything functional in the library, I think, right? Like everything's just functions or higher order functions.
Yeah. So a lot of the operators are. So another, like, Tracy's exactly right, but I don't know about just learn observables and don't learn promises. I think there's a lot of people that would really, I like it though. Yeah, just keep going with that. The observables are a means of kind of encapsulating any number of values that you want pushed at you later on. So what an observable actually gives you is like a set of events. And when you have sets of things, there's different operations you can do. Like you can combine them, you can filter them or query them, you can transform them into a different set. So it's just a way to get like a set of events. And the implementation of it is, it's basically just a function that when you call it, you pass this observer to, and the observer's got a next method, an error method, and a complete method on it. And the next method is the one that most people care about. It's the one where you get events or basically values pushed at you. So you can wrap an array in an observable. You can wrap button clicks in an observable. You can wrap just about anything in an observable. And then everything kind of becomes the same shape. And you can use the ability to kind of query and combine and filter and whatever to do some pretty interesting things with it. So it's a very powerful tool. The downside to it is I think that a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their head around it, because it's got its own kind of vernacular to it with all of these operators. And operators would be things like filter and map and merge map and these things. So there's a little bit of a learning curve, but once you get to that point, you can do some really amazing things and with very little code. And that's the big advantage of observables.
And Ben, I just want to add actually to Ben usually says the phrase that it's like Lodash for async. So it's like a utility library for doing your async stuff, which I think is helpful for a lot of people when they're first starting off. But it's not entirely accurate, just because it's not all about async. Most people are going to be using observables for async things, because that's why it's particularly useful, but it's actually a synchronous primitive by default, unless you're doing something inherently async with it, like making an AJAX request or getting values through a WebSocket. And then those are things that are the most common use cases for people getting started with observables. Is they want a primitive that they can make an AJAX request that's cancelable, and then do easy things like debouncing and throttling and all those type of things. Those things are all really easy to do in RxJS, but might be a little harder to do the more traditional procedural way.
So can promises and async await, can they kind of be mixed with observables, or is it kind of like a all or nothing buy-in?
Yeah, you can 100% mix them together. So promises and async await is a way to do like serialized asynchronous actions in like what looks like one function. It actually executes almost as though there are several different functions, but it allows you to run code to a certain point and then wait for something to happen, and then run code to a next point and wait for something to happen. You can, and then it of course returns a promise. You can actually wrap that in an observable with there's a function in RxJS called defer. So you can say defer and then pass to it an async function, and it will return to you an observable that when you subscribe to it runs the async function. So that's one way, one direction. And then the other direction, you can take an observable, and there's a couple methods on observable that allow you to subscribe to it in such a way that it returns a promise so you can await it. One is for each, and for each is exactly what it sounds like. It's just like the one you'd see on an array, where every time a value is emitted, there's a handler that gets called. And when it completes, it's returned a promise that will resolve when it completes. So then you basically await, the completion of an observable, and then you can continue on in your async await. And the other one is just toPromise, which is just give me the last value from the observable, and whenever the observable completes, resolve with that. And so that's another way you can await a value coming from an observable.
I think the other thing I really like about just RxJS in general is because it's a language that sits on top of JavaScript, it allows me to play in all the different frameworks and libraries and just copy paste most of my code. So I always like to see how easy it is for me to write something, let's say in Vue, and then how much of it can I copy and paste into a React app? And the same thing when I'm building a React app, how much of it can I just copy, paste, and dump into an Angular app? And it's like 95%, if not more, which is super, super cool.
Yeah, if you decide you want to go down that route, that's kind of RxJS. One of the beauties of is that it can be used just as a simple async primitive for making AJAX requests, and that's all you use it for, and that's super useful. Or you could go all in and use it to implement all of your business logic. There's, I know lots of people that do both, that just use it as a simple primitive, and others that go all in. There's even entire UI like frameworks built around this, like Cycle.js, which goes completely all in on RxJS. Like what Tracy is mentioning, there's things like on the Angular side, there's something like NGRX and NGRX effects, where you will use RxJS to write a large majority of your business logic. And there's an equivalent thing that's framework agnostic called redux-observable that Ben and I made while we were at Netflix. That's for doing all your side effects and your business logic inside of Redux, but using observables. And so if you do it that way, if you do choose to go down that route, your code is portable, because RxJS is not specific to React or Angular or anything like that. It's just generic. And so then your what UI library you end up using just becomes basically a view layer, a stateless view layer. And there's, it's not all that way, because like you wouldn't want to put, like, for example, like a drop-down menu. You wouldn't want to put that state in like your Redux store or something like that. That would be local state. So that's why it's like 90% of your business logic would be in RxJS in that case, and the rest would be in local components and stuff like that. But it definitely can get you a long ways there to making an app that could be portable between different platforms. The UI framework of the year, it changes so rapidly sometimes. Some of us are sometimes looking for that way of making something resilient against that change. And RxJS can be one of those things. But I think it's just important to continue to stress that you don't have to go all in on RxJS and use it everywhere. We sometimes jokingly say Rx all the things to refer to that, but you could just use it as a simple async primitive for AJAX requests, and it still has a lot of value.
And I was just going to ask, so what inspired you to write Redux Observable, and what made you choose Redux over other options like MobX or?
Sure. Well, at the time when Ben and I were working at Netflix on these apps, MobX actually wasn't really a thing. It probably existed, but it was not something we had heard of. This is many years back. And we had used Redux and we bought into it and we liked the predictability and the simplicity of it. It does get a little, a lot of boilerplate, and you can reduce that by having your own conventions around that. But one of the things we found is that, we had our logic inside of our React components, but we had the reducers, and then we put all of our side effect stuff like AJAX requests and WebSockets in our React components. And our stuff just kind of got strewn around, and it became harder to test and harder to reason. And we were big RxJS people, so we were trying to figure out a way to bring RxJS into React. And every way we did it worked, but we felt like we were not approaching it with the right way, because it's like sometimes we'd be using Redux, and sometimes when we'd be using this custom RxJS thing inside of React, and it felt like we were context switching, when we'd like a more consistent way of doing our side effects. And we started to think about it, and we looked at existing prior art, and there was Redux Saga, which was a huge inspiration for us as well, because redux-observable is very similar to it in theory. In practice, there's some major differences, and we liked the idea of thinking about a stream of all of the actions that you could dispatch. Your app dispatches an action. You can think of that as a stream of actions that you dispatch. And you can have these things, which we call epics, which are very similar to sagas, if you're familiar with Redux Saga, that are basically sitting there while your app is running, listening to that stream of input actions. And then they can respond to an action that they want to. So if they filter that stream out and they're looking for a particular action, like fetch user, they can then go and fetch that user. And when that user response comes back, the epic can then dispatch a new action to notify the store of the result of that side effect. So an epic approaches it as an isolated piece of RxJS code that its inputs are a stream of actions and its outputs are a stream of new actions. And so that's the way it communicates, and it doesn't have any knowledge of components. Like, it knows nothing about React and should never know anything about the DOM and stuff like that. Instead, it just actions in and actions out. And we think it's a great way to isolate your logic and test it independently, and then also have your app be fairly maintainable. But it is. I will stress that going all in on that and using that approach can be difficult for a lot of people, especially if you're not familiar with RxJS. I don't typically recommend people just say, I've never used Redux, I've never used RxJS, I'm just going to build a brand new app and I'm going to learn all of those things while I'm doing it. That can be pretty overwhelming. I know people who have done it and they've done it successfully, but I also know more people who have tried it and just been frustrated at how much they have to learn. Learning all the Redux patterns and learning RxJS at the same time can be a lot to take in. So instead, I typically recommend, if someone's interested in this, is try it out on some of the most complex parts of your applications. Like, we used it primarily on places where our async stuff is particularly complex. Things where we're dealing with WebSockets or needing more complex things like exponential back off, which is where, like, you'll make a request. If it fails, you'll back off. You'll delay retrying for a certain amount of time. And then if it fails, you exponentially back off more, and then you back off more, et cetera, so that you're not spamming the server, or you're not using undue system resources and stuff like that. Ben, do you have anything to add to that?
No. I think that, I think you've pretty much covered the entire thing, and for the most part, just to add a little bit more clarity at a higher level to it is, anything where you're synchronously updating state still lives in Redux, and anything where you're like, I need to go do some async thing, be it an HTTP request or get something via WebSockets, or it could even, you might even be playing an animation where you actually have some side effects, but you want to dispatch an action that does something else when you get done to update state. Those end up being moved to redux-observable. I think the hard part for people, be it in redux-observable or in NGRX effects, which is the equivalent of redux-observable, is people trying to figure out what they should and shouldn't do there. And actually, this is true with Redux in general, like people figuring out what they should and shouldn't store in state. And, the worst part about it is it's kind of like no 100% right answer. Like, a lot of people will be like, I need to store errors that happen in my Redux state. And I'm more of the school of, no, you could just have a side effect that notifies people that there's been an error, because whenever you load that app, if you wanted to like rewind time, you don't really care about the error state. You just care about the state that's correct, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know. There's some nuance to it, but I definitely agree with Jay that you would not want to dive into Redux Observable without understanding anything about RxJS. You would probably want to learn some basics like basic operators, maybe like the three basic merge strategies, stuff like that, before you proceeded with something like Redux Observable or NGRX effects, depending on where you're working.
Yeah, and interesting about the NGRX effects, like Ben was saying, that's the equivalent of Redux Observable on Angular side. And we actually didn't know that we were inventing the exact same thing at the same time for a good year. I was introduced to Rob Wormald, who was one of the creators of it, and we discovered, because this was before it was pretty popular and before Redux Observable was popular as well, and we both discovered that we had came to the same conclusion on the same pattern. Ours being more framework agnostic, but theirs being better integrated into Angular, like their dependency injection stuff it works with and all that. So it's interesting I guess it felt great to have some confirmation that other people think that it's a good pattern. And I've actually been surprised at the level of adoption of Redux Observable. Companies like Slack, like the Slack desktop app, uses it heavily. Then there's Nuclide by Facebook, which is like it's a built on top of Atom. It's an IDE. So it's been interesting to see the different uses of Redux Observable.
So RxJS has been kind of like but it's been added, I guess, to Angular now. It's kind of like part of the framework. Is that right? For people that are like not into Angular, like we're React people that are listening probably, I'm kind of interested to hear like the reasoning behind that and kind of like how it kind of, what problems I guess it solved. And are there any like similar use cases in React, or is it more around state management? I mean, this is kind of a completely off the wall question, maybe around Angular, because I'm not familiar with it. So it's kind of like just a general, I guess, question around that.
So in Angular, RxJS is an actual dependency for Angular, and it gets used for a variety of different things. It's used now heavily in some of the new animation stuff they're doing. It's used for form validation. It's used in the router and the upcoming router stuff, I think, pretty heavily. So they've really kind of embraced it. So it gets used for a wide variety of things. But outside of Angular, RxJS gets used for a lot of. Because if you consider that an observable is a primitive from which you could actually build a promise, like you could build promises, a promise library based off of observables if you wanted to. It's primitive enough that it can be used in pretty much any JavaScript environment. So I've seen it used in Node services. It was used in Node services actually at Netflix pretty frequently. It gets used obviously in the front end. It gets used on its own with no framework.
Well, I think it's sort of unfortunate that because it is such a large dependency to Angular, that people sort of assume that like RxJS and Angular are closely tied together. But in reality, we see a lot of people using RxJS with React. So I don't know if there's more people, but there's a very, very large portion of the React population using RxJS and or Redux Observable. Because I think in general, RxJS as its own domain-specific language allows you to maximize reactive programming, right? So a lot of the different paradigms, or, it just sort of makes sense to do so and gives you these operators and abstractions to allow you to be able to do so really easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there actually was discussions by the React core team. The React core team, my understanding, the last I've talked to them, they're not huge observable people, but they definitely see the merit. And there was actually, Sebastian Markovich had a proposal, I think it was a year, maybe 2 years ago, to potentially add like a more native support for observable as part of like a life cycle on a component to manage your subscriptions. Because that's the awkward thing about it right now is you have to manage the subscriptions a lot more. And so there might, Vue actually is the Vue library, the actual framework called Vue, is a really good example of something that is very similar to what React was considering doing, like a lifecycle method that would be called and it would subscribe to any observables that you provided, and then it would unsubscribe from them correctly when the component unmounted. And But in the end, the React team at this point, at least, has decided to punt on that problem. They're focusing a little bit more on not a little bit more, they're focusing a lot on their new suspense and the async rendering and stuff like that. So, and the developer experience in components is not awful. It's not as first class as something like Angular, where they have like this special syntax inside their templates for subscribing to observables for you. But you can also get clever. There's a lot of libraries. There's several different ones for being more clever about consuming observables, components that you can pass an observable to and it will subscribe to it and unsubscribe to it at the correct times. Those type of things. There's utilities around that.
That's really interesting. So I remember when you said that conceptualizing in terms of observables can be difficult and the learning curve can be high. Like, what's the best way for someone to get started learning RxJS?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of good articles on things like Medium and stuff like that. I mean, I would say start off by just going to the RxJS docs. And there's actually a brand new initiative to creating better docs, because the docs have had some trouble in the past, not with being outdated, just being hard to find, like hard to search, because we used ES docs to automatically generate them, and it kind of had included a lot of extraneous results, and so you really had to know where to look to find them. But the new docs significantly improved that, and Tracy can talk more about that because she's been helping lead and organize those efforts. But also, I mean, I know this is kind of a shameless plug, but you could also attend one of the workshops that Ben and I put on. Ben, Tracy, and I, we run RxJS workshop. And we do it online as well as in person, and we also do private ones for companies as well. And those are a great way to really just turbocharge and in a single day go from nothing to having a pretty solid understanding. It can be a little overwhelming, but I think it can give you also a really good start to supercharge you and give you that resource. And then you can also follow up and ask those individual questions and stuff like that and get a lot more hands-on time. Other than that, there's Gitter channels and Slack channels as well, where you can ask questions, and there's several people who are pretty active on Stack Overflow on answering questions. I mean, and so that's my take. Tracy, yeah.
I was just going to say you could do what I did with it and just like go into like a JS bin or a Stack Blitz and import it and play around with it.
Oh yeah. That's what I did for a while is just played around with different scenarios and actually try and almost reverse engineer. You're trying to figure out why did that behavior happen? Like, I'm not looking at the code. I'm just trying to, I play with an operator and then find out, okay, that behavior makes sense, or this behavior doesn't make sense. And so I want to learn more about it.
Deploy more, pay less with DigitalOcean, the simplest all-in-one cloud computing platform for developers. Scale and run cloud applications faster and more efficiently with effortless administration tools to robust compute, flexible configurations, networking services, real-time alerts, and rapid provisioning, while enjoying industry-leading price to performance with a flat pricing structure across all global data center regions at any usage volume. Spend more time building better web apps and less time worrying about managing infrastructure with DigitalOcean. Build your next app on DigitalOcean. Get started with a free $100 credit at do.co/roundup.
Tracy, do you have anything to add on the doc side of things?
Yeah, the Docs initiative has been fun. I initially got involved because I kept hearing people complain about it, and Ben and Jay would just throw their hands up and be like, yeah, can somebody help? And I kept trying to find people in the community who would want to do it. So you know how in open source, everybody says like, yeah, I'm going to do it, right? And so we had so many people say that, and then it would never happen. And so finally I said, okay, obviously if this is ever going to happen, I'm going to have to take the lead on it. So I decided to do it. And what's evolved from that is really amazing contributors who are actually now starting to contribute to RxJS core itself. And so, I just had to jumpstart it a little bit, and then everybody sort of like poked around and filled in the blanks. But right now, we just recently launched the RxJS API docs. So if you go look for the official RxJS documentation, that's the new docs initiative, currently hosted on Firebase for a quick second, where you have much prettier and much better API docs. What's currently happening right now is this migration from the content side. So we were doing all these JS bins of real world examples, better code examples of how to use specific operators and putting that in. Well, right now it's in a different repo. So right now the docs team is just like merging it all into one repo. I think one of the difficulties that people have with RxJS when they used to look at the docs is the fact that it literally is just API documentation, right? And so it's not very beginner friendly. And as a beginner, you sort of want a little bit more details. I'm glad that I'm a beginner sometimes when it comes to some of these things, because Ben's like, who reads these things? Why do we need 7 paragraphs? And it's like, excuse me, you need to walk me through this.
That's awesome.
I'm too lazy to read 7 paragraphs. I am.
Is there like an 80-20 rule of RX as far as like the API is concerned? I know when it first came out, there was like a lot of stuff you could do, but there was also a lot of methods that were available. But with, so for instance, with JavaScript, the array methods, you can get a lot done with like map, reduce, and filter. Is there like a sample of APIs that people could learn to kind of like kickstart their productivity with RxJS?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I would say you've got map and filter, obviously. Instead of reduce, there's scan would be the one I would go for there, which is basically reduce, only it emits the value you're reducing to every single time. There's other simple ones like take or take last, where you're just saying, oh, take 3, or take and skip. Like those are kind of familiar idioms from a variety of other collection types that you'd find in other languages, like enumerables in C# and stuff like that. So take and skip, which do exactly what it sounds like. They skip a few values and then start, giving them to you, or they take a few values and then stop. Those are important. And then there's these special operators that are flattening operators, really, or merge operators. And there's one's called like merge map, and then there's concat map, and then there's the last one is switch map. So basically with those, you're looking at situations where you have an observable of observables. And this is where it gets kind of mind-bending for a lot of folks. In what you're actually trying to do is you take, with say switch map, for example, you're saying, oh, I'll start with merge map. You're saying, with merge map, you're saying, I'm going to subscribe to one observable, and I'm going to take the value of it, and I'm going to map it into a new observable. And then I'm going to subscribe to that and take all its values and send it into the observable that I'm returning. And then the next value comes in and you map that into another observable. Now you've got 2 running, and you're taking all those values and sending them out. So
have we lost you yet?
Yeah. So this is why I recommend playing with it, reading the documentation. Mostly, in my opinion, playing with it is very important, and getting an idea. But those merge map, concat map, and switch map are the ones that I think the majority of people are going to have a hard time wrapping their head around. But once you get those, then everything is cake. There's all sorts of other really helpful ones, but I think those are kind of the biggest ones. There's ones for like catch error, for catching errors, that it's probably important. But there's helpful little ones like timeout with, like that people hardly ever use, but it'll come up one day and be like, oh, I really need some sort of thing that when it times out, it plays this other observable. Okay, well, there's an operator for that. But the API is really, the surface area is really, really big, and a lot of people get intimidated by it. So I just tell people, start simple, start with like filter and map, and then just subscribe to it and do whatever you have to do with it. And then try to learn like merge map, concat map, switch map, those. And usually at that point, as people walk away from learning those things, they're pretty good to go.
And I would second what Ben said about just subscribe. That's what when I am teaching people about RxJS, I tell them early that when in doubt, just call subscribe and do it how you would normally do it. Do it how you would have done it before, procedurally or imperatively or even functionally with your Lodash or what have you. You can always just call subscribe and just get the value and then do whatever you want with it. So if you don't learn the reactive way, it's totally fine. Right. And I did want to add.
That sounds awesome. Actually, that made my something.
Yeah, cool. That's awesome. And then there's one thing I wanted to add about learning RxJS. Ben has a really great Medium article, learning observables by building them, or learning observable by building observables, what it's called. And for me, I think I never thought of it that way until Ben actually made that post. And I think it actually, even though I had already become, I was actually very well versed in RxJS, it actually made it additionally click with me. I think it really simplified it even in my brain when I read that. And I think it also helps when I explain it to other people that way as well. So I think that's a really great resource.
So I'd like to go back to the documentation effort really quick too. What Tracy's done there has been nothing short of phenomenal, because it's been the one sore point in RxJS land is the documentation, and we've got these really awesome people working on it now, and it's kind of breathed a lot of new life into the community that way. I would say the number one goal for RxJS in the short and the long term is to make sure that documentation is accessible and documentation is available and easy for people to read and understand. And like it's a very big deal. I can't tell you how happy I am to see all that stuff being taken care of and done very well. So I just want to thank you again, Tracy, for getting that started, because it would still be in a horrible state if it were left to me.
Yeah. Well, I only can do so much, right? So,
right. Well, and then the demand's getting higher and higher too. Just recently, over the last few months, there's been this strange upswing in RxJS usage, where now on the day-to-day downloads on NPM, we're nearing what React has. So in 1 week, it was like 2 million downloads in NPM or something like that. I don't know what's driving it at all.
You created a bot.
Jay created a bot.
I did, yeah.
But yeah, there's also been a noticeable uptick in people asking questions or people wanting to contribute new operators and various things. So I think that documentation is going to be more and more and more important as time goes on. Probably more important than actual the core library contributions are. So that's a really big deal.
And I mean, the other thing with the docs is we're planning on adding examples of using this with React. So we're going to be creating React getting started guides, React Native getting started guides, and every single operator will have an associated real world example. So anybody who's playing around with it, especially if you're just getting started or whatever, not only if you have extra time and want to play with open source, but even just documentation on helping with figuring out those things for operators and creating these little examples for us is really, I think it'll benefit you all everyone in the long run.
Yeah, anyone listening to this, if you want to be on your favorite open source personality's radar and be their absolute favorite person, contribute to the docs. Because believe me, when I say that, on the technical side, there's so much planning and stuff that goes into that a lot of that is handled or at the very least planned out. And on the documentation side, it's all I don't know, we'll get to that eventually kind of things. And then it piles up and it's this horrible cliff that you see coming. So if you want to really make your open source people love you, contribute to their documentation, they'll really love you for it. And that's any open source project, I'm sure, is happy to have you contribute to that.
That's a really great point. I feel like contributing to documentation is underrated, but so valuable. And also learning something well enough to write about it means that you're learning it really well. So it's also a great way to learn, just like teaching.
Oh, yeah. I'd take one doc writer over 2 engineers any day. Writing documentation is hard and it's important.
So what's, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No.
Mine was about, so I guess one last thing on the docs. So if someone does want to contribute to the docs, can they just pull the GitHub repo down and edit there and then submit a pull request? Is that how that works?
Yeah. Now it's right in there's some confusion because there's an older RxJS docs repo, but we've now merged all the documentation app and all of the work that's been done there into RxJS master. So any issue, the actual documentation is all done inline with the code and JS-doc comments. And there's some markdown files that also get merged in, but yeah, there's a docs-app folder underneath the master repository where all of that work is done.
So what's next for RxJS?
Well, I'm working on an experimental branch right now where if you go to the repository and you switch the branch to experimental, the README will be different, and there's a design doc in there that describes the work being done. But basically, it's loosely based on Andre Staltz. He has a library called callbags, and callbags essentially has the same concept as observables, but it only uses functions. The downside to callbacks is it's not particularly ergonomic, and it also isn't in the shape of observable, which there's so many people using right now that, I couldn't just be like, oh, I'm changing the shape of all of RxJS. Have a nice day. Like, that would work out well for a lot of people. So there's the work being done in the experimental library is kind of implementing all observables in terms of these functions, and the library then is becoming a lot smaller and a lot faster. So right now it's all in experimental and just kind of going through and implementing things, seeing how they work out, and then the plan is that inevitably we'll harden all of that and we'll look at it and say, okay, here's the few things that we needed to change with the public API in order to get this to work. And then you go into the stable version of RxJS and you say, these things are deprecated, or we need to add these things. And then we let that live for a while until we have a chance to, create some migration tools to help people migrate to the new library and some documentation and things like that. So, just recently though, I don't know how many people are familiar with this. In the Angular community, it's old news, but, in the React community, it might be newer. We did release RxJS 6, and in the process of doing so, we had a lot of people contribute a lot of amazing work around having backwards compatibility with version 5, having TypeScript-based like TS-lint rules that would automatically update your code for you to the new version. So the friction with migrating your code from or updating your code from RxJS 5 to RxJS 6 was very, very minimal in comparison to what people might have done with libraries like this in the past. So I haven't heard of anyone doing stuff like this before. So it was a bit of an experiment, but it was a very successful experiment. Just within Google, we updated thousands and thousands of files that used RxJS with these TS-lint rules, for example, in a matter of minutes. And, everything just worked, which is amazing, right? So there's a lot of work that people did here at Google. There's a lot of people that contributed external to RxJS, or that were new contributors to RxJS, that added all the backwards compatibility stuff. And we got a lot of support from the Angular team around that. So that's been pretty amazing. And we're going to try to do that again whenever we have another major version release, which, it's that the timeline on that is a little bit more iffy. It's not like RxJS still isn't like React or Angular, where there's a dedicated group of people working on it for a company. So it's harder to set, I'm going to release every 6 months kind of timeline. I'm working on it more full-time now than I was before, but still not totally full-time. But, that's just one person, and there's a whole community of people that work on this stuff. So our release dates are a little bit more squishy than, say, React or something. But
would you say they're smushy?
They are smushy. No, smush. That's bad.
Are we using the smush map operator for that?
Yeah, there's some bad history about smush there with the 6.0 release, actually. But guys, you guys just distracted me.
I got you.
Yeah, we'll probably be between 6 months to a year out as far as another major version release goes.
And the 1.0 release of redux-observable is actually coming up here shortly. We're on 1.0 beta 1 right now. I just released beta 1 just a couple days ago, in fact. And we've had several alphas before that, and I've been slow to adopt 1.0 simply because I was waiting for redux-observable to gain a little bit more traction and get a little bit more feedback from the community before we committed to the API. And there has been some changes that have been made, I think, for the better. Instead of having access to the store directly, if you're already familiar with redux-observable, this might be useful to know, but instead of having access to the store directly, you get a stream of state that you can subscribe to. So you can either compose that, or you can also get the current value of the state just off of a value property on it. And that removes the store.get state function, but it also removes store.dispatch inside your epics. It doesn't remove store.dispatch inside your UI. You still do that dispatching normally, but inside your epics, it was an anti-pattern before to call store.dispatch inside of them, because it's very not the RxJS way. It's very imperative. And we still provided it simply as an escape hatch, just because, at the time when we originally created it, we didn't have a ton of confidence that this was a good pattern. We had no idea really. And reason why we're removing it is because we have just discovered that instead of it being, a nice escape hatch, it's instead just a major foot gun. That there's actually been whole tutorials on YouTube about how to use redux-observable, and the whole tutorial just showed you using store.dispatch inside of the epic instead of composing them.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I asked the author to take it down, and he was very kind, and he did, just because it's teaching someone the wrong way. But I think a lot of it was our fault, is because people are very familiar with store.dispatch, and
No way, you asked him to take it down, really?
Yeah, he was very kind about it. And I was nice to him about it, but
that'd be a hard conversation. Like, I'd be so.
No, I just said, hey, like this, because I discovered that because someone on Stack Overflow, was asking a question on how to do something, and I gave them the answer, and they said, what do you think about this instead? This looks easier, and I'm like, oh no, don't do that.
That's rough.
It was rough. It mainly just made my heart sink a little bit because I felt like it was our fault that we shouldn't have given them that foot gun to shoot themselves in the foot with, which I think we're correcting that in 1.0. So
I think that's the hardest part about open source in general and learning things. And I'm really spoiled because I get to talk to Ben and Jay, or I feel like I should just start from the top, because any advice I give now, or I get now, I always wonder, or blog posts, it's like, is it right? How old is it? It's a month old. Are they doing it right? Do I trust them as a developer?
Well, yeah.
It's hard. It's hard.
Levels of right. There's a lot
levels
of
right.
Yeah, and I think you were talking about this the other day, Tracy, about how like Ben and I have this bad habit of never answering a question directly, or should I do X?
Maybe.
Yeah. It depends. Maybe it depends on this, because it is tough. Like after a while you start to become, I don't know, I kind of go through phases of like, clarifying everything. And then other times not clarifying anything and just being like, yeah, sure. Sounds
Jay, I just discovered your new nickname. You want to hear it? Pretty bad.
Oh no.
Janel.
Oh no.
Janel.
I don't know. Jay what?
Anal J. Janel.
Oh, Janel?
Good reviews. I'm just kidding. I love you.
Not suitable for work.
Yeah. What? If you ever want Jay to review your PRs,
yes.
Jay is. this is why I love you so much. Though he's so particular and always cares about quality. Like, what did you call him? The human linter. You used to call him the human linter.
Anybody else would have released redux-observable like a year ago. Anybody else? Not Jay. Jay's like, no, this needs to be perfect. So
yeah, it's a curse.
It's been perfect for 2.0, Jay.
That's true. That is I actually subscribe to that, and if I was giving advice to someone else, that's exactly what I would say. 1.0 early, perfect with 2.0.
So we're kind of getting close to being there on time, but I did want to discuss one more topic maybe real quick before we wrap it up. Something that like rings in my head around the API for subscribe is working now with GraphQL. And I think like the idea of subscriptions kind of would work along the same lines as something like RxJS. I have, I guess, two questions around this. One, does Apollo or any of these GraphQL clients, are they using RxJS under the hood to do subscriptions? And are the subscriptions that people are working with in some of these GraphQL clients on the front end, are they similar to kind of what the API or the type of workflow you might see in RxJS if they haven't really used it before?
I've actually never had the privilege of using GraphQL full time, but I've played with it a bunch and then helped others as well. And the last I knew of it, there was actually a decent usage of RxJS in the GraphQL Apollo space in there, but it was not built into it. I know I recall, I don't want to say I know, I recall there being discussions about doubling down on observables and it becoming their first class primitive. But last I knew, you had to use an add-on. There was an extra community add-on to use observables instead. Ben, have you heard anything lately?
Yeah, so I know that some of the Apollo people have approached me at a couple of Angular events in the past, and there's a special Apollo client that provides additional support for RxJS.
Yeah, that's what
and I think that's where most of the Apollo people would direct you to. But I mean, Rx it's such a malleable thing that, I mean, really what most libraries are, like say you're talking about Vue or RxView or Vue Rx or whatever it's called, or what is it? John Lindquist just has a React library called React Streams. It's actually pretty cool. What they boil down to, and even redux-observable for the most part, what it boils down to is I'm going to take some existing API and then adapt it into observables so you can do observable-y things with it and then call that API. Like, so, and it's usually, they're all pretty lightweight. Like the Redux observables are a pretty small library. At least the core pieces of it are anyways. Mm-hmm. And all of these things tend to be that way. So if you're ever like, oh, I wonder if there's an Rx, thing for this, whatever, that probably is. That's been my discovery. There's usually someone who's already written a wrapper for it. But yeah, Apollo definitely has, I think it's like Apollo client -RxJS or something like that exists. So.
All right. So I guess we'll go ahead and get to the picks.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
I guess we'll go. Ben, do you have any picks today?
For React, I really do like what John Lindquist has done with the React Streams library he put together recently. It's pretty neat. It basically just adds a component that you can provide a stream to and a bunch of other really interesting helpers. And then it uses the, I don't know if the pattern's actually called render props now, but basically you have your children, or you just pass a function in there, and inside of that function, it gives you the values that are being emitted by that observable. So there's a variety of other interesting things it does, but that's like the core bit of the functionality, and it's pretty cool if you want to use RxJS directly with React in kind of a straightforward way, just to kind of play with RxJS. So that's one of my picks. The other pick I would have would be StackBlitz. If you're not familiar with StackBlitz, you should get familiar with StackBlitz. It's basically Visual Studio Code in the browser, and it has React templates, Angular templates built in, or just you can play with TypeScript or whatever. So it's really, really cool. So that's my other pick.
Sia, do you have any picks?
Yes, so this past week or two, I've been, I have this client, and they know that their website's not working, but that doesn't really help me come up with a way to redesign and redevelop it with just what's not working. So we've been looking a lot at the Sprint book, the one written by Jake Knapp, and it was developed at Google, and then they improved on it some more at Google Ventures, and it's just a really cool way to think about how to do a rapid prototype. So that's my pick for the week.
Jay, do you have any picks?
Yeah, so I've got a lot of people have probably heard of it by now, but Ryan Dahl, the guy who originally created Node.js, he announced and open sourced the beginnings of a new project. I think it's called Deno. I've never heard anyone pronounce it, but Deno. And it's kind of, my understanding is that it's kind of like what if I could go back in time and change about Node? Because he has some regrets, and I haven't watched his talk from I think it was in React Europe or JSConf Europe or one of those, where he actually talked about these regrets of Node. And the Dino project is interesting because like it's TypeScript first, like instead of JavaScript, you're using TypeScript, and there's no package JSON, like you import directly from URLs, and it's sandboxed first. That's another thing that's major different is like you have to opt into privileges and stuff like that. And so it's a much heavier sandbox. I believe he's wrote most of it in Go. So it's kind of an interesting, it's far from production at this point, but it's kind of an interesting thing to keep your eye on and see what clever things Ryan comes out of it. My other pick would be the other day I had, there's a company called Appli Tools, APPLI Tools. They gave me a demo of their product. It's for like screenshotting, like it's kind of like testing via screenshots of your apps. And I remember, like I was telling them, I was very skeptical because I remember using something like that, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. And the technology just wasn't there. Like it was every little minor change in pixels or graphics card changes. There's so many things that the human eye can't perceive, but would cause the tests to fail or be, changes and stuff like that. So I kind of wrote it off, but the Appli Tools company seems to be really, have kind of perfected it. And I know they use things like machine learning and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting to check out. There's a free plan, and I think that they also offer an open source plan. So open source maintainers can do it for free and stuff like that. So if you have like an open source project or something like that, you can check it out.
Tracy, do you have any picks today?
I've been thinking through all these picks. Like, one second. Okay, I got one. Yes, so fashionnova.com. It's hilarious that I'm promoting fashionnova.com, but I was watching Kylie Jenner's Instagram the other day, and Kylie Jenner was wearing this dress. And so I went to this website, and granted, 50% of their clothing is highly inappropriate for, I think, anybody to wear in public or anywhere else. But I did buy some things. And that were appropriate to wear outside. And, shockingly, everything fit me, and I'm keeping everything. I think I bought like 10 pieces of clothing, and I'm keeping everything. So, ladies, if you're looking for cute clothes, check out Fashion Nova or Francesca's, which is my other favorite place, which has fully appropriate conference clothing and has basically been my entire wardrobe for conferences for the past few months.
Tracy gets a lot of compliments on her Francesca's dresses that she wears to conferences. I've witnessed it.
Mm-hmm. And I have to thank Chloe Condon, who works at Century, who told me about it at a conference. So I'm super glad there's more women going to conferences because we get to learn from each other on our fashion choice.
The conference ladies fashion mafia. It happens. It's a real thing.
So for me, my pick is JS Camp. It's a new conference. It's at chicagojs.org if you want to take a look at it. They're having an emphasis on first-time speakers. So if you're looking to kind of speak at your first conference, give this one a shot because they're going to be looking to accept a lot of first-time speakers. Also looks to be a good conference. I know one of the co-organizers is Peter Pikarczyk. If you've ever listened to React Native Radio, he's one of the co-hosts there. And he just went through Y Combinator on a startup pitch. And now he's back in Chicago and he's organizing this. So looks like a cool conference. So check it out if you're near Chicago or even if you're not near Chicago. Well, I guess that wraps it up today. So thanks everyone for coming on the show and for taking the time out of your day to join us. It was really nice chatting about all this stuff.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great.
Fun time.
All right, well, that wraps up this episode of React Roundup. We'll see you next week. Peace.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.